3 days lost. The cat's return uncovered a 40-year-old mystery. Mark Holloway sat on his porch, staring out at the empty street. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and damp wood, ruffling the edges of the missing cat flyers he had taped to the wooden railing. It had been 3 days since Jasper disappeared, and Mark had barely slept. Jasper wasn't just any cat. He was family. The orange tabby had been with Mark for 5 years, ever since the night he showed up at his doorstep during a thunderstorm, shivering and drenched. Mark, a retired journalist who had spent most of his life chasing stories, never thought he'd grow so attached to a stray. But Jasper was different. He was clever, independent, and had a way of understanding things, almost as if he could read emotions. And now he is gone. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. He had searched everywhere, down by the docks, behind the old lighthouse, through the narrow alleyways of their quiet coastal town. He had knocked on doors, called the local animal shelter, even left Jasper's favorite blanket outside, hoping he'd pick up the scent and find his way home. Nothing. Still no sign of him? A voice called from the sidewalk. Mark looked up to see Mrs. Bennett, his elderly neighbor, peering over her garden fence. She clutched her tiny white dog, Daisy, close to her chest. "Not yet," Mark said. She shook her head. "That cat of yours is smart. He'll come back when he's ready." Mark nodded, though worry gnawed at him. Jasper had never been gone this long before. He had his routine: morning naps on the porch, afternoon adventures around town, and evening cuddles on Mark's lap while he read. Something wasn't right. That night, Mark sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. The street was quiet, the only sound coming from the waves crashing against the shore in the distance. He left the porch light on, hoping Jasper would see it. At midnight, he thought he heard scratching at the door. His heart leapt, and he rushed over. But when he flung it open, there was nothing. Just the wind. His chest tightened. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe Jasper was really gone. The thought was unbearable. The next morning, Mark grabbed a fresh stack of missing cat flyers and walked through town again. He stopped by the local diner, where the owner, Pete, frowned as he shook his head. "Haven't seen him, Mark," Pete said, "but I'll keep an eye out." Mark left a flyer on the bulletin board and moved on. At the bookshop, the owner, Emily, looked concerned. "Jasper always stops by in the mornings. He likes sitting in the window," she said. "This isn't like him." Exactly, Mark thought. Jasper wasn't just lost. Something had happened. He spent the rest of the day searching, his hope slowly fading. When evening came, he returned home, exhausted. He slumped into his chair and ran a hand through his graying hair. That's when he heard it. A faint meow. His head snapped up. He rushed to the door and threw it open. There, standing on the porch, was Jasper. Mark let out a breath of pure relief. "Jasper, where have you?" Then he noticed something strange. Jasper wasn't alone. Around his neck, tied with a delicate ribbon, was something that made Mark's heart pound. A small, faded photograph, and tucked behind it was a handwritten note. Mark's fingers trembled as he reached for it. He had been right. Jasper hadn't just been lost. He had found something, or someone, and whatever it was about to change everything.
Mark's hands trembled as he untied the ribbon from Jasper's neck. The small, faded photograph felt fragile between his fingers, like it had been hidden away for years. The edges were curled, the ink slightly smudged, but the image was clear. A young woman standing in front of an old house. Mark's heart pounded. He had seen that house before. But where? He swallowed hard and turned his attention to the note tucked behind the photograph. The handwriting was delicate, almost shaky, as if written by someone elderly or weak. "He found me, just like you used to. LM." Mark's breath caught in his throat. LM. The initials tugged at something deep in his memory, something long buried. His mind raced as he stared at the note, his pulse quickening. Who had Jasper found, and why did they know him? He looked down at Jasper, who sat calmly on the porch, licking his paws as if he hadn't just unraveled a decades-old mystery. "You little detective," Mark murmured, scratching the cat's head. Jasper purred, rubbing his face against Mark's leg. Mark turned back toward the house, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. He sat at the kitchen table, laying the photograph and note in front of him. The woman in the picture was young, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair and a kind smile. The house behind her looked old, with a white fence and ivy creeping up the walls. Something about it seemed familiar, but Mark couldn't quite place it. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. LM, the name tickled the edge of his memory, just out of reach. And then, like a sudden gust of wind knocking over an old picture frame, it hit him. Lillian Monroe, his mother's best friend. Mark sat up straight, his heart hammering. Lillian had been a part of his childhood, a warm, laughing presence who had spent many afternoons at his family's house, drinking tea with his mother and telling stories about her travels. But then, one day, she was just gone. His mother had mentioned it in passing when he was in his early 20s. Lillian moved away, Mark. Some people just need to disappear for a while. But she had never explained why. And Mark, caught up in his own life, had never questioned it. Until now. Jasper had found her. Mark exhaled sharply. That meant she was still alive. And she had sent a message. He picked up his phone and searched the local property records. If Lillian had stayed in town, there had to be a record of her house. After a few minutes of searching, he found it. A small house on the edge of town near the cliffs. His stomach twisted. That house had been empty for years, or so he had thought. Had she been there all along? Mark glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but sleep wasn't an option now. He grabbed his jacket and keys, whistling for Jasper. "Let's go see what you found, buddy." Jasper meowed and followed him to the door, tail flicking. The night was quiet as Mark drove through the winding roads toward the cliffs. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense trees that lined the road. He pulled up to the old house, parking just outside the rusted gate. The place looked even more run-down than he remembered. The white fence from the photograph was now chipped and broken. The ivy had swallowed most of the walls, and the windows were dark. Mark hesitated for a moment, then pushed open the gate. It let out a long, creaking groan. Jasper leapt out of the car and trotted ahead confidently, like he had done this trip before. Mark followed, stepping carefully up the overgrown path to the front door. His fingers hovered over the doorbell, but before he could press it, a light flickered on inside. Mark's breath hitched. Someone was home. He knocked, his pulse thudding in his ears. Seconds passed. Then footsteps. The door opened just a crack, revealing a pair of wary blue eyes. Mark's breath caught. Lillian? The door opened wider, revealing a frail but familiar face. Lillian Monroe stood there, her once dark hair now streaked with silver, her body thinner than he remembered. But her eyes, they still held the same warmth, the same depth. "You came," she said softly. Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. "Jasper brought me." Lillian looked down at the cat, who had already waltzed inside and made himself at home. She smiled. "Clever boy." She stepped aside. "Come in, Mark. We have a lot to talk about." The inside of the house was unexpectedly neat. Dusty, yes, but not abandoned. Books lined the walls, and a single lamp cast a warm glow over the living room. The air smelled of old wood and faint traces of lavender. Lillian sat in a worn armchair, motioning for Mark to take the couch. Jasper curled up on the rug between them. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Mark spoke. "I thought you were gone." Lillian sighed. "I was, in a way." "Why?" She hesitated, then reached for a small wooden box on the side table. She opened it, pulling out another photograph, this one older, yellowed with time. It was of two people, Mark's mother, and a man Mark didn't recognize. "Your mother and I, we had a secret," Lillian said. Her voice was quiet, like she was peeling back layers of memories she hadn't touched in years. Mark frowned. "What kind of secret?" Lillian met his gaze. "The man in this picture," she said, tapping the photograph, "was my fiancé, and he was murdered." Mark stiffened. "Murdered?" Lillian nodded. "And I ran because I was afraid I'd be next." Silence fell between them. Mark's mind raced. His mother had never mentioned any of this. And now, after all these years, Jasper, his cat, had somehow found Lillian and brought him straight to her. "Why now?" he asked. "Why send the note?" Lillian's expression softened. "Because Jasper reminded me of something. That running doesn't solve anything, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop hiding." Mark exhaled slowly. His cat had uncovered a decades-old mystery, and now he was right in the middle of it. Mark leaned back in the worn-out couch, his mind spinning. Jasper, now sprawled across the rug, licked his paw lazily as if he hadn't just unraveled a decades-old mystery. Lillian Monroe, his mother's best friend, the woman who had vanished without a trace, was sitting right across from him. And now she had just dropped a bombshell. Her fiancé had been murdered. Mark swallowed hard. "You're telling me? You disappeared because you thought you'd be next?" he asked. Lillian nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of the old photograph she had pulled from the wooden box. "The night it happened, I knew my life would never be the same," she murmured. "And I was right." Mark exhaled. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Lillian hesitated, then leaned back in her chair, staring at the dim lamp in the corner. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "It was 1978. I was engaged to Michael Dawson. He was kind, smart, and a little too curious for his own good." Mark leaned forward, listening intently. "Michael was a journalist. Like you," she said, giving him a small smile. "He worked for the local newspaper, but he had his eye on bigger things. He was investigating something he wouldn't talk to me about. He said it was dangerous, but he promised once he got the story, we'd leave town and start fresh somewhere else." Mark's stomach twisted. He knew what chasing a dangerous story felt like. Lillian's voice wavered. "And then one night, he never came home." She paused, her fingers tightening around the photograph. "They found him the next morning," she whispered, "by the docks. His car was still running, his notebook missing. The police said it was an accident, that he must have slipped and drowned." Mark frowned. "But you didn't believe that?" Lillian's blue eyes locked onto his. "Of course not. Michael could swim. He hated the water, but he was a good swimmer. And his notebook? He would never go anywhere without it. Someone took it. Someone didn't want his story getting out." A chill ran down Mark's spine. "And you?" he asked. "What happened after that?" Lillian exhaled. "I was devastated. I tried to push for answers, but no one would listen. The police shut the case, and then strange things started happening." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" She swallowed hard. "Phone calls. Someone breathing on the other end, never speaking. My apartment was broken into, but nothing was stolen. Just my papers were moved. My drawers were searched." Mark's journalist instincts kicked in. That wasn't a random burglary. That was a warning. Lillian sighed. "I panicked. I packed up, left town, and never looked back." Silence filled the room. Mark stared at her, trying to process everything. He had come here thinking Jasper had simply found an old friend. But instead, he had stumbled upon a murder mystery that had been buried for decades. "You really think someone killed him over that story?" Mark asked. Lillian's lips pressed into a thin line. "I know they did." Mark exhaled. This changed everything. Jasper hadn't just led him to a long-lost friend. He had uncovered a cold case. Mark ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind racing. He couldn't just sit on this information. "Lillian, do you still have anything from back then? Anything Michael might have left behind?" he asked. Lillian hesitated. "Only one thing," she said, rising from her chair. She disappeared into another room and returned a few moments later with a small leather-bound journal. "He gave this to me a week before he died," she said, handing it to Mark. "I haven't opened it in years." Mark's fingers tingled as he took the journal. It was old but well preserved, the edges of the pages slightly frayed. He flipped it open, scanning the faded ink. Inside were notes, names, dates, but nothing immediately clear. And then, at the very back, scribbled hastily in Michael's shaky handwriting, was a single sentence that sent chills down Mark's spine. "If anything happens to me, follow the money. Start with Westport Shipping." Mark's breath caught. Westport Shipping? That was a major company back in the 70s. It was involved in everything from importing goods to political funding. He looked up at Lillian. "Michael was onto something big," Lillian swallowed. "I know." Mark's mind raced. If Westport Shipping was the key, then someone had made sure Michael never got the chance to expose them. And if that was true, someone might still be watching, Mark murmured. Lillian paled. "Do you think—" "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But after all these years, if Jasper could find you, someone else could too." The thought made his skin crawl. Mark stayed at Lillian's for another hour, combing through Michael's journal. But the more he read, the more uneasy he felt. The details were vague. Michael had clearly been digging into something corrupt, but had been careful not to write down too much in case the wrong person found it. Still, the name Westport Shipping was a lead, and Mark knew exactly where to start. "I need to check the archives," he muttered. Lillian frowned. "Archives?" Mark nodded. "The newspaper archives. If Michael was investigating something, there might have been articles, things that never got published." Lillian hesitated. "Do you think it's still dangerous?" Mark exhaled. "I don't know, but I do know one thing. Michael died trying to expose the truth. If I walk away now, then whoever silenced him all those years ago wins." Lillian's hands trembled slightly as she set her empty teacup down. "Be careful, Mark." He met her gaze. "I will." Jasper, who had been dozing peacefully, suddenly sat up, ears twitching. His fur bristled. Mark frowned. "What is it, buddy?" Car engine rumbled outside. Mark stiffened. Lillian's face paled. "I don't get visitors." Mark quickly moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. A black sedan sat at the end of the driveway, its headlights off. Mark's stomach turned to ice. Someone was watching, and they knew exactly where to find them. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears as he peered out the window. The black sedan remained motionless at the edge of Lillian's driveway, its dark windows making it impossible to see inside. "Mark," Lillian whispered. "Who is that?" "I don't know," he murmured, keeping his voice low. His gut told him this wasn't just a coincidence. Then, without warning, the sedan's engine roared to life. The tires crunched over gravel as the car reversed, disappearing into the night. Mark let out a breath, but his mind was still racing. Whoever they were, they had been watching, and they wanted him and Lillian to know it. By the time Mark returned home that night, his exhaustion was overpowered by adrenaline. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were onto something dangerous. Jasper, curled up in the passenger seat, let out a slow, knowing purr. "You really dragged me into something big, didn't you?" Mark muttered, scratching the cat's head. The next morning, Mark wasted no time. He drove straight to the Springfield Gazette archives, the newspaper office where he had worked in his younger days. If Michael Dawson had been working on a major story, there had to be some record of his research. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old ink, and the massive shelves were crammed with yellowing newspaper clippings. Mark approached the archive librarian, a bespectacled woman named Diane Carter. "Diane," Mark said, trying to sound casual. "I need to look up some old files from the late 70s. A journalist named Michael Dawson." Diane frowned. "Michael Dawson? That's a name I haven't heard in a long time." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "So you remember him?" "Of course," she said, adjusting her glasses. "He was one of the best reporters we had, but his last few months here were strange. He was working on something big, but he kept his notes locked away. Then one day he was just gone." Mark swallowed hard. "Would his notes still be here?" Diane hesitated. "Maybe. I'll check the restricted archives." Mark waited as Diane disappeared behind a locked door. Jasper, sitting by Mark's feet, flicked his tail impatiently. After 20 minutes, Diane returned, looking troubled. "Mark, his files are missing." Mark stiffened. "Missing? As in misplaced, or as in they're gone," Diane said, like someone didn't want anyone finding them. A chill crawled down Mark's spine. Someone had erased Michael's work. Determined to dig deeper, Mark left the archives and drove straight to the Springfield Public Library. If Michael had been looking into Westport Shipping, then local business records might still exist. After an hour of searching, Mark found an old corporate filing from 1978. His eyes scanned the document. Westport Shipping had been funding political campaigns, local development projects, and something called the Clearwater Expansion Project. Mark frowned. The name sounded familiar, and then it hit him. Clearwater was the site of an environmental disaster in the late 70s. A massive chemical spill had poisoned the town's water supply, forcing hundreds of residents to evacuate. The company responsible had mysteriously gone bankrupt before they could be sued. Mark's blood ran cold. What if Westport Shipping had been involved, and Michael Dawson had been about to expose them? Was that why he had been silenced? Mark took out his phone and snapped a picture of the document. Then, as he turned to leave, he noticed something. A man in a dark jacket was sitting at a nearby table. He wasn't reading. He was watching Mark. Mark's stomach clenched. It wasn't paranoia anymore. Someone following him. Mark forced himself to stay calm. He tucked the documents into his bag and walked toward the exit, acting as if he hadn't noticed the man. Jasper, sitting in his carrier, let out a low growl. He knew something was wrong. Mark reached his car and climbed in, his hands gripping the steering wheel. He checked the rearview mirror. The man in the dark jacket had followed him outside, and he was now talking on his phone. Mark didn't wait. He started the car and peeled out of the parking lot. His heart pounded as he took a sharp turn toward the highway. His mind raced. He had no doubt that this was connected to Michael's murder. And now someone wanted him to stop digging. Mark's grip tightened on the wheel. Too bad. He wasn't stopping. Mark pulled into Lillian's driveway just as the sun dipped below the horizon. He knocked urgently on the door. Lillian opened it, concern in her eyes. "Lillian, we need to talk. Now." She let him inside, locking the door behind him. Mark dropped his bag on the table and pulled out the photocopied documents. "Lillian, I know what Michael was investigating," he said breathlessly. "Westport Shipping was behind the Clearwater disaster, and someone made sure that the company disappeared before they could be held responsible." Lillian's eyes widened. "You're saying Michael found proof?" Mark nodded. "And they killed him before he could publish it." Lillian sat down heavily. "All these years I thought I was running from ghosts, but I was running from real people. People who knew I might have had access to Michael's notes." Mark hesitated, then pulled out his phone. "We need to do something with this information." "Like what?" Lillian asked. "Like expose them." Lillian looked doubtful. "It's been 40 years, Mark. Do you think anyone will care?" Mark's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but I have to try." Jasper let out a loud staring intently at Mark as if urging him forward. Mark nodded. This wasn't just about uncovering an old murder anymore. This was about justice. Just as Mark was about to make a call to a journalist contact, a loud noise shattered the silence. A rock crashed through Lillian's window. Mark's blood ran cold. He ran to the window and looked outside. The black sedan was parked across the street again, and this time, someone had left a note attached to the rock. Mark picked it up, heart pounding. "Stop digging." His breath caught. Lillian paled. "Mark, they know." Mark looked at her, then down at Jasper, who stared defiantly at the note, as if daring them to do something worse. Mark gritted his teeth. They weren't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The note in Mark's hands felt heavier than a simple scrap of paper. Stop digging. The message was clear, the warning undeniable. But instead of fear, a fire ignited in Mark's chest. For 40 years, someone had buried the truth. For 40 years, Michael Dawson's death had been brushed aside. For 40 years, Lillian had lived in fear. No more. Jasper, still perched on the windowsill, let out a low, guttural growl, a rare sound from him. His tail flicked sharply, his golden eyes locked onto the shadowy sedan parked across the street. "Mark," Lillian whispered, clutching the edge of the table. "What do we do?" Mark exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He was a journalist. He had spent his life chasing the truth. And if there was one thing he knew, it was this. The best way to protect yourself was to make sure everyone knew what you had. "We don't run," he said firmly. "We go public." Lillian's eyes widened. "Are you sure? If we do this, there's no turning back." Mark met her gaze. Michael risked his life to expose this story. If we back down now, his death was for nothing. Lillian hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, let's do it." Mark wasted no time. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Ethan Carter, investigative journalist for the Boston Chronicle. Ethan was one of the best. He had exposed corporate fraud, political scandals, and even uncovered police corruption in Boston. If anyone could blow this story wide open, it was him. Mark pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Then Mark Holloway. Ethan's deep voice came through the line. "It's been a long time. What do you have for me?" Mark took a steadying breath. "A story, Ethan. A big one. And I need your help to tell it before someone buries it for good." There was a pause. Then, "I'm listening." Mark quickly laid out everything. Michael Dawson's investigation, his suspicious death, Westport Shipping's involvement in the Clearwater disaster, and the threats that had just started coming in. By the time he finished, Ethan let out a slow whistle. "Jesus, Mark, if this is true, this could be one of the biggest corporate cover-ups in decades." "It is true." Mark said, "and I have proof. Documents, records, and Lillian Monroe, Michael's fiancée. She's been hiding for 40 years, afraid for her life, but she's ready to talk." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'm getting in my car. I can be there in 3 hours. Don't do anything until I get there." Mark nodded. "We'll be waiting." Mark hung up and turned to Lillian. "He's on his way." Lillian let out a shaky breath. "Do you think we'll be safe until then?" Mark glanced back out the window. The sedan was still there, watching, waiting. "I don't know," he admitted. "But we're not alone anymore." Jasper jumped down from the window and padded over to Lillian, rubbing against her legs. She smiled weakly and bent down to scratch his head. "You really did bring me back to the world, didn't you, boy?" Mark couldn't help but smile. He's got a habit of doing that. The next few hours dragged on. Every shadow outside the window made Mark's heart pound. Every passing car made Lillian flinch. But finally, just after midnight, headlights appeared in the driveway. A black SUV pulled up and a man in his early 40s stepped out. His sharp blue eyes scanned the house before he knocked firmly on the door. Mark opened it. "Ethan, you made good time." Ethan smirked. "Speed limits are just suggestions." He stepped inside, immediately getting to work. He set up a recording device and placed a notebook on the table. "Okay, let's hear everything from the beginning." Lillian took a deep breath and began talking. She told Ethan about Michael, about the night he disappeared, about the threats that followed. She described the fear that had haunted her for decades, the regret of never fighting back. When she was done, Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Lillian, this is powerful, and with the documents Mark found, we have enough to go public." Mark nodded. "We need to release it all at once, so fast they won't have time to stop us." Ethan pulled out his laptop. "I'll write the article tonight. First thing in the morning, it goes live." Mark's pulse quickened. This was it. They were about to expose everything. At 3 a.m., just as Ethan was finishing his draft, a loud thump came from outside. Jasper hissed, his fur standing on end. Mark froze. Ethan exchanged a look with him. That didn't sound good. Mark grabbed a flashlight and peered through the blinds. The black sedan was gone. But on the porch, something had been left behind, a manila envelope. Mark hesitated, then slowly opened the front door, grabbing the envelope. He brought it inside and dumped its contents onto the table. Inside were printed photos. Photos of Mark, of Lillian, of Ethan, all taken within the last 24 hours. And at the bottom, a single note. "This is your last chance to walk away." Lillian covered her mouth. Ethan stared at the note, then at Mark. "You still want to go through with this?" Mark met his gaze without hesitation. More than ever. At 6 a.m. sharp, the article went live on the Boston Chronicle's front page. It was titled, "The Murdered Journalist, a 40-year cover-up finally exposed." Within minutes, the story spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up. Twitter exploded. Politicians, activists, and legal experts began calling for investigations. By noon, the state attorney general announced a formal reopening of the Clearwater case. By evening, Westport Shipping's current CEO resigned. Mark's phone rang non-stop. Reporters, lawyers, even people who had lost loved ones in the Clearwater disaster wanted to talk. And by nightfall, Lillian, after 40 years, finally felt free. A week later, Mark stood with Lillian outside Michael Dawson's grave. She placed a single white lily on the stone, tears welling in her eyes. "You did it, Michael," she whispered. "We did it." Jasper sat beside her, his tail flicking gently. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder. "He'd be proud of you." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I think I can finally stop running now." Jasper let out a soft purr as if in agreement. Mark smiled. "Looks like you're finally getting your happy ending, Lillian." She glanced at him. "And you, Mark? What about your ending?" Mark thought for a moment, then chuckled. "I think my story's just beginning." Jasper stretched, then trotted down the path ahead of them, leading the way, as if he knew exactly where they were meant to go next.